What if we told you that there are animals around us that are smarter than 7-year-old children? These creatures can count, use tools, even solve complex problems. They have a phenomenal memory and can plan for the future. They understand the principles of cause and effect and anticipate the results of their actions. They also troll other animals, including people. Over the past few years, scientists have found more and more shocking discoveries about the intelligence of these creatures. It seems that we will soon have to reckon almost on equal terms with a biological species that we have never taken seriously. Sounds like a description of a highly evolved primate, doesn't it? But we're actually talking about crows. Today, you are going to learn how crows revealed Archimedes' principle, why crows have been painstakingly taking revenge on a resident of India for many years, why do crows prefer cash or bank cards, and how come that with a brain the size of a hazelnut, crows are smarter than many monkeys. Crows. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and press the bell icon to see even more interesting and enlightening videos. People have long ago noticed the amazing abilities of crows. This is true not just for crows, but for the entire crow family, which includes crows, ravens, magpies, jays, rooks, and jackdaws, about 130 species in total. And yes, when we say long ago, we mean a very, very long time ago. The legendary ancient Greek fabulist Aesop, who lived around 600 BC, has even dedicated one of his most famous fables, The Crow and the Pitcher, to this phenomenon. The fable is about a thirsty crow who stumbles upon a pitcher filled with water. But the pitcher is not filled to the brim, and the crow cannot reach the water with its beak. Unable to tilt the jar either, the bird throws pebbles into it one by one until the water rises to the top of the pitcher, enabling it to drink. About 2,600 years later, people decided to see if Aesop's fable may not be a fable at all. In August 2009, a study published in Current Biology showed that rooks, relatives of crows, behave exactly the same way when put in a similar situation. The experiment was then replicated many times in various scenarios. The researchers added conditions to the experiment to see how the crows would solve more and more problems. For example, in this footage, we see a New Caledonian crow being offered 2 treats in 2 different vessels. In both vessels, the treat is on the surface at the same level, but one vessel is filled with water and the other with sand. The smart crow did not even try to throw stones into the right vessel with sand, but went straight to the left one. It seemed that it realized from the very beginning that this trick would not work with the sand. Well, perhaps it was not so difficult for the crow to guess it at once. Then they did another experiment. The vessel with water was the same, but the stones were bars of white material. They were of the same size, but some were heavy while others were light. And then an amazing thing happened. The crow alternately takes the heavy bars and throws them into the vessel. And when grabbing the light ones, throws it aside and grabs the next one. It's heavy, and the crow throws it into the vessel. I mean, do you see what happened? The crow weighed the bar on its beak, realized that it was light, figured out in its mind that it would not sink in the water, so it wouldn't be useful, and threw it aside as unnecessary. But even that wasn't enough for the scientists. They kept changing the conditions, put containers of different widths with different initial water levels. They gave the crow different materials, but the result was always the same. The New Caledonian crow quickly or sometimes even immediately, understood what and how things should be done to receive a treat. Finally, they decided to literally make the crow fail, like in an exam. They came up with the following plan. There are 3 vessels with water. The middle one is the narrowest. There's a tasty treat floating on the surface. The crow obviously can't get it. The water level is too low to reach with its beak. There are pebbles on the table next to it. Their size is deliberately picked up so that they do not fit in the middle of the vessel with the treat. Yet, they can freely get into the side vessels. Why was this done? Because cunning researchers connected the middle, the narrowest vessel, under the table with the neighboring one, the right one. According to the principle of communicating vessels, the left vessel stood separately. If a stone is dropped into the right vessel, the water level rises both in it and the middle vessel. And on the left side, there is the same wide beaker, but it is not connected with others. And if a stone is thrown into it, it will not affect the water level in the narrow vessel with the treat. Do you see what the point is? The problem cannot be solved bluntly. One needs not only to experiment, but also to work out the right cause and effect relations. In these shots, you can see how the crow solves the problem. After several trials, the crow guesses that it is necessary to throw a stone not just into a neighboring test tube, but into the one that works right. In essence, the crow playfully passed the test for knowledge of Archimedes' legendary discovery, although, naturally, they did not attend school. Let's recap. According to the legend, the ancient Greek scientist and engineer Archimedes was lying in a bathtub with water and suddenly realized a simple principle that the volume of displaced water is equal to the volume of the body immersed in this very water. It was this discovery that made him run and exclaim, "Eureka!" which means, "I've found it." As you can see, the crows are not far from this discovery too. Or maybe they made it a long time ago. Well, at least the New Caledonian ones could have done it. After all, they are considered to be one of the smartest in the crow family. You may wonder why. Well, if the experiments with crows and water did not impress you much, then get ready to be really astonished. For many years now, researchers have been conducting many experiments with great apes. Therefore, a monkey that deftly wields a stick to get something is not a sensation anymore. But if a monkey were to make its own stool, it would probably have a bombshell effect on the scientific community and mankind. Why this analogy? Let's start from the top. What else do New Caledonian crows do that makes them the smartest? They know how to use self-made tools. And they're so good at it that sometimes even experienced researchers are stunned. In 2002, behavioral scientists from Oxford University observed the behavior of a New Caledonian crow named Betty. This cult video shows its astounding achievement. In the experiment, a small bucket of food was placed inside a tube. The crow couldn't reach the bucket because of the length of the tube. Then it took a short coil of wire and, after several vain attempts to hook the bucket with it, guessed to bend the wire to form a hook, and then easily pulled out the bucket. Moreover, the crow repeated this behavior in 9 out of 10 subsequent trials. Betty truly surprised everyone with this. She was called a unique and amazingly smart bird. But that was all just a walk in the park. The experiment was again made much more complicated. The bird had to solve an even more difficult task. First, use a short stick to get the longer one, and then reach the treat using it. Betty coped with this task easily too. Later on, many similar experiments with New Caledonian crows were conducted. Scientists increased the complexity of the experiments and were always amazed by the bird's ingenuity. And some of the experiments have shocked researchers. Alice Ausberg from the University of Vienna and Alejandro Kelchnik from Oxford, who have long been researching bird intelligence, published an article in Scientific Reports stating that the New Caledonian crows are able to assemble tools from spare parts. Scientists conducted a series of experiments. 8 New Caledonian crows had to get a treat from a container. To do this, they had to use a long stick. In the beginning, the sticks were placed around the box, and the birds used them successfully. All 8 crows took the sticks and got the food. But then, the pre-made long sticks were replaced by short sticks, which, however, could be used to make a long one by joining them together. Some of the short ones were a little wider, others a little narrower, and the narrow ones just had to be inserted into the wide ones. 4 of the 8 birds, without any instructional demonstration, figured out what to do, put the sticks together, and got the food. Then the task was made more difficult. The short sticks could be connected to each other, not directly, but with the help of a special adapter. And there was one among the crows who, having examined the objects, realized the purpose of the adapters. And this smart fella could assemble a stick of the required length not only from 3, but even from 4 elements. It was once believed that only humans could make tools. Then it was assumed that only humans and chimpanzees could make tools. Then it was thought that only humans and chimpanzees could make tools by assembling them from different parts. Do you now realize the extent of how we have underestimated the crow family? The fact that a bird can assemble a useful tool from several different parts is kind of like a monkey being able to craft a stool using a hammer and nails, without any instruction. This begs the question, how? How and why did we overlook such abilities in crows? Anyway, this is just the beginning of our story about the intelligence of crows. Next, you will learn things that will certainly impress you. But first, let's briefly explain how we, sensible people, missed an almost intelligent species right under our noses. Even though people have long noticed that these feathered creatures are obviously smarter than other birds, no one really cared about their intelligence. Despite observations, it was long and stubbornly believed that they have no intelligence. Why? The point is that studies of the mind were based on human material, for obvious reasons, and then on primates as our closest relatives, and then on mammals in general. And we all share one common feature in terms of our ability to think: the neocortex, the very gray matter of the brain we think with. It's the gray matter that's responsible for the higher nervous activity, which is thinking. Now, birds don't have a neocortex. It's not primitive. It's not underdeveloped. It's simply missing. Absolutely. So, scientists have long had an ironclad belief: no neocortex, no thinking. That is why they closed the question of bird intelligence without even trying to explore it. They said, these are just instincts about everything, and that's it. But the crow family didn't care about the conclusions of researchers. They continued to successfully solve complex problems against all odds. The number of observed cases of exceptionally clever behavior grew, and it became increasingly difficult to ignore them. Eventually, it came to laboratory experiments, which we've already told you about, and we will tell you more. And their results could not be ignored. It turned out that these birds not only catch up with some mammals in terms of intelligence, but also surpass most of them. Can you imagine a mouse skillfully manipulating tools the way a crow does it? That's something not every dog can do. So the scientists had to change their approach. Given the advanced cognitive activity, it was necessary to revise the fundamental approaches. They started with what was beyond doubt. 1. The neocortex is something the birds have never had and never will have. That's a fact. 2. In mammals, the neocortex is responsible for intelligence. That's also a fact. 3. Birds do have intelligence and other complex mental functions. That's another fact. The obvious conclusion is that the brain architecture of birds is fundamentally different from that of mammals. We just need to understand what it's like. A real breakthrough happened when scientists got such advanced technologies as tomography, encephalography, and other things, allowing us to monitor in real time the activity of different areas of the bird's brain without dissecting its skull. It turned out that the key to the secret lies in the very specific structure of the brain of the crow family. First of all, the size of a single neuron. Bird neurons are much smaller, so all other things being equal, there would be much more of them to fit into the space available. The second point is the denser packing. Birds' neurons are not only small, they are packed very densely into the available volume. Scientists from Charles University in Prague and their colleagues from the University of Vienna and Vanderbilt University conducted large-scale studies, during which it turned out that the specific density of neurons in parrots and crows is twice as much as monkeys and 4 times as much as rodents. The third point, from quantity to quality. In addition to size and packing density, bird neurons have one more feature. They have more dendrites, neurite outgrowths, and therefore more connections with neighboring cells. Fourth, these compact, branched, densely packed neurons are grouped in so-called neuroglial complexes. Mammals have them too, but they are very different in terms of structure. While in mammals they form so-called columns, birds have globular clusters. They simply work more effectively than columns. In combination, all these factors produce the overwhelming effect that has made the crow family so clever that sometimes it feels kind of creepy. For example, how about a crow that knows how to use a vending machine? Actually, it's another tricky test of their intelligence. Dr. Sarah Gelbert of Cambridge University, who developed it, explained that she needed to see birds learn something completely new in order to study their cognitive abilities. The idea was to create a task that would have no similarity to anything that crows might have previously done in the wild. And for that, it was decided to use paper, in a way that would definitely not help the crow to get something edible in the forest, so it would have to think completely from scratch. Scientists have built a device that really worked as a simple vending machine for birds. The crow had to put a piece of paper into the slot, after which it received a treat, a piece of meat. First, the crows were shown how the machine works. Smart birds quickly grasped the concept and began using this life hack. But then the scientists made the task more difficult. They gave the crows 2 large sheets of paper, which did not fit in the slot. According to Dr. Gelbert, about half of the tested crows quickly and independently realized that the paper should be torn into smaller pieces. But there was more to come. The scientists wanted to see if the birds could make a paper token of the right size from memory. The researchers equipped each of the 8 tested crows with a personal vending machine that dispensed treats only when a certain size of the paper was inserted. Then, Dr. Gelbert explained, we tested whether they could remember which size worked, and whether they would make it themselves. The birds didn't have a template. They just needed to memorize the size of paper token needed for their particular vending machine. And the birds successfully accomplished the task. Okay, if crows have so easily learned how a conditional banknote works, then maybe they can do accounting too. You may laugh at it, but they certainly know how to count. Researchers from the University of Tübingen decided to test this assumption. To ensure that no one had any doubts, scientists Helen Ditz and Andreas Nieder equipped a pair of crows with surgically implanted neural sensors. Then they were trained to play a little number-guessing game. On a screen, the crows were shown a set of dark dots, 1 to 5, inside a gray circle. In about a second, the screen would go out for a second, and then a different image would be shown. If the second screen shows the same number of dots, the crows should touch the screen with its beak, and then it gets a treat. And now for an important point. Note that the crows were not shown numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. They were shown just the different number of dots. That is, it was assumed that the crow would not just recognize a similarly shaped image, but would count the number of dots. To exclude the possibility of recognition, the arrangement and size of the dots were different, so that the crow would have to count, not recognize the shape. The second image contained the same number of dots as the first image in exactly half of the cases. And the birds identified their number correctly in about 75% of the cases. This is much higher than the 50-50 probability of a random guess. Crows made the most mistakes with the numbers 4 and 5. That is, as the task became more complicated, it became more difficult for them to count, which also indicates that the results were not random. What was going on in the crows' brains at that time? While the birds were doing all of these calculations, sensors in their heads monitored the activity of about 500 individual neurons. About 100 of them changed activity depending on the number of dots the crow was counting at a particular moment. And different groups of neurons were involved in this process. Some neurons were turned on when there was only one red dot, while others were connected to the calculations when there were 2 or more dots. Scientists noticed striking similarities to how similar processes take place in the primitive brain. Why is this surprising? Because, let us recall, that the brain architectures of birds and primates are very different. Against this background, scientists from the same institute were nearly shocked by the results of another fascinating experiment. Do you know what recursion is? Software engineers and linguists will immediately grasp it, but let's explain it to everyone with a simple example. Look at this sentence. Catherine told John that Susan had eaten the ice cream he bought. Here, the sentence refers to its own part, the embedded phrase, Susan had eaten the ice cream, which in turn refers to the nested phrase, he bought, with nested references to John and the ice cream. This is an example of grammatical recursion. Such nested constructs are common in human languages. Otherwise, we simply would not be able to construct complex phrases. However, even humans have a limited ability for grammatical recursion. After a certain depth of nesting, we lose the context and can no longer understand who did what to whom. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? That's why even educated people read texts with long and complex sentences slowly and carefully. Grammatical recursion of other living beings is much worse. Until recently, scientists believed that recursive thinking is only possible for humans. Other animals, roughly speaking, lack the depth of memory at the fundamental neurobiological level. But just recently, in 2020, everything changed. For the first time, American biologists have shaken this belief by setting up simple experiments with humans and monkeys. Of course, no one told the monkeys stories about Catherine, Susan, John, and ice cream. For them, the task was greatly simplified, literally down to characters. The role of phrases in the experiment was played by sequences of brackets of different shapes. The test subjects were shown random pairs of brackets and asked to arrange them in recursive similarities of phrases for a tasty reward. For example, like this, or like this. It was important that the inner brackets of one shape symbolized the nested construct, and the outer brackets of another shape symbolized the nesting itself. Adults easily coped with this task, but children of 3 to 4 years old were wrong in almost half of the cases. The most interesting thing is that adult monkeys performed at about the same level as these kids. Although the monkeys needed more time to learn the rules of the experiment than the kids, an extra session was required. It does indicate that humans are not the only ones who can grasp the essence of grammatical recursion. But that's monkeys. What does that have to do with birds? You might wonder if the crow family has shown itself to be just as good as humans, albeit small ones. Surprisingly enough, yes. Biologists from the above-mentioned University of Tübingen decided to conduct a similar experiment with black crows of the species Corvus carone. The test birds were shown random sequences of brackets, and they had to use beak strokes to build the brackets into recursive phrases. To the amazement of the scientists, the crows didn't even need additional training. After standard familiarization with just a few samples, these birds correctly constructed conditional phrases like this or this in 40% of cases. And don't be confused by this 40%. It's not a low percentage. On the contrary, it's a huge result. It's amazing! Because in the case of a random search process, rather than a meaningful arrangement, the desired result would have been obtained far, far less often. Skeptics might suggest that crows are guided solely by the shape of brackets, assuming that opening brackets should always go first and closing brackets last. But then the birds would build crossed and irregular phrases like this or this, and they would build them as often as correct recursive sequences. But this was not observed. However, not all experts agreed with the conclusions of this experiment in 2020. French cognitive psychologist Arnaud Rey argued that the very design of the experiment allowed the animals to cheat and produce the right answers using simple associations. To eliminate this possibility, the German biologists made the experiment more complicated. They added a stage with 3-level recursion in the form of phrase sequences of the following type. If the crows did not understand the essence of grammatical recursion and generated the necessary answers by some other means, the frequency of recursive phrases would have decreased even more. But this did not happen either. Crows coped well with 3-level constructs as well. Let's emphasize it again. If it seems to you that there is nothing difficult in the arrangement of brackets according to a fairly simple pattern, just keep in mind the fact that not all children of Homo sapiens coped with this task. And we are talking about birds, which until recently were considered to be, although not stupid, but certainly not capable of thinking. How about another extraordinary skill? Recently, another group of scientists from the same University of Tübingen discovered for the first time that crows can operate statistical logic. Dr. Melissa Johnston, Humboldt Fellow at the University of Tübingen, assessed the new traits of these creatures based on several years of work. In our lab, it has been shown that crows have sophisticated numerical competence, demonstrate abstract thinking, and show careful consideration during decision-making, says Melissa Johnston. Briefly, the experiments proceeded as follows. Johnston and her team began by training 2 crows to peck different images on touch screens to get a treat, starting with a simple pecked, got a treat sequence. The researchers then upped the ante. Here is how Dr. Johnston explains it. We introduced the concept of probabilities, such as that not every peck to an image will result in a reward. This is where the crows learn the unique pairings between the image on the screen and the likelihood of obtaining a reward. What's the challenge here for the crows? The crows were challenged to learn fairly abstract values rather than the usual integers. Then they had to associate them with abstract symbols and then apply that combination of information to maximize the reward. And the crows quickly learned to associate each image with a varying probability of getting the reward. Note that it wasn't a simple sequence of do-get, but it was more likely or less likely. Something even more amazing is the consolidation of these complex skills. Johnston and her colleagues made the experiment more difficult by waiting a full month before retesting. And even after a month of no practice, the crows didn't forget the probability of reward. After 5,000 tests, the researchers found that both crows continued to choose a higher probability of reward, indicating that they were capable of statistical reasoning. Statistical reasoning involves using limited information about a situation to draw conclusions and make decisions. There is no chance for simple instincts here. One needs to think. Scientists also point out the special attitude of the crow family towards food as a clear marker of their extraordinary intelligence. You probably know that many animals stock up for the winter, like squirrels. Dogs often bury something edible. But these are mammals, and we're used to treating them as smart creatures. So the behavior of the crow family is much the same, and even has some unexpected and surprising features. Crows, for example, also know very well that if there is too much food, it can be stashed away. They make hiding places in fallen leaves or find even more secluded spots. And when they are hungry, they know exactly where to go to find their supplies. And the most amazing thing is that sometimes they even put markers on the stash so they can find it faster. It seems that if we give a crow a GPS tracker, it would be able to learn how to use it. Crows have also been spotted carrying food from one place to another to re-hide it from other hungry mouths and beaks. They even know what food spoils first and eat meat before other types of food like nuts or bread. Crows have another amazing ability that is simply astounding. You've probably heard of the so-called marshmallow experiment. Let us briefly remind you of its essence. A child is given a marshmallow and has a choice: eat the marshmallow immediately or wait 15 minutes and get 2 marshmallows. It's called delayed gratification. This is not just a funny test, but a serious study that was conducted in the 1970s and called the Stanford Marshmallow Experiment. Observation of the experiment participants in the subsequent years showed that children who were ready to wait for a double reward were more successful in life than those who preferred less but now. So a similar study was carried out with crows, and guess what? They proved to have self-control abilities. First, the researchers tested the food preferences of the crows: bread, grapes, sausage, fried pork lard, and other treats. Each of the birds had different favorite foods. They were then offered their least favorite food. After waiting from a few seconds to 10 minutes, the researchers offered the birds a tastier treat or a larger portion of the same food. The crows had the option of grabbing whatever was available here and now and flying away. But by doing so, they would deprive themselves of a chance to get the tastier treat. So the crows involved in the study were willing to wait for the treats they would enjoy more. And they didn't want to wait to get a second serving of the same snack. Only after getting the most desirable food did the crows leave the test site. Other birds, such as pigeons, chickens, and gray parrots, did not show much self-control during a similar experiment. However, you don't have to be a scientist to notice that crows have some pretty amazing behavior that reveals a great deal of ingenuity. It's enough just to observe them. For example, some time ago, the shots of Tokyo crows, which managed to use the city traffic for their own benefit, spread around the internet. Namely, the crows learned to crack nuts with the help of passing cars. The crows fly to busy intersections, wait for the red light to turn on, and throw walnuts directly onto the roadway. When the light turns green, the cars start moving, running over the walnuts and splitting them. When the light turns red again, the traffic stops, and the cunning crows come out on the road and enjoy the walnut's core. It's well known to us that car wheels can squash something, but how do crows know that? Yes, they may have seen something getting hit by the wheels and becoming flat. There's a whole way to go from that observation to figuring out a way to crack a nut. The birds should have been smart enough to link the following in one logically connected chain: the color of the traffic light, the frequency of traffic, and the fact that they can crack something here. However, Japanese crows have been noticed many times by abnormally clever behavior. A crow trying to buy a subway ticket from a vending machine is particularly notable. This footage shows the crow trying to interact with the touch screen, pressing the next button. Then, as if realizing that it needs to pay with something, it moves away and brings a bank card in its beak, which it seems to have stolen from a woman at a nearby machine. According to eyewitnesses, having failed to pay for the ticket, the bird returned the stolen goods and flew away. So everything looks really as if a crow deliberately wanted to buy a subway ticket. Of course, this is hard to believe since it would be totally over the top. But who knows? However amazing all the described displays of intelligence and ingenuity in the crow family may be, it is not this that surprises, amazes, and even shocks us the most. What then? It's what makes them eerily similar to us: their social behavior. How do birds of the crows family actually communicate with each other? Crows and ravens caw, we know that. And that's it? Not at all. It turns out that the crow family has a very wide range of communication tools. In 2011, Simone Pica from the Institute of Ornithology in Schweizwiesen, Germany, and Thomas Bugniar from the University of Vienna, Austria, found that adult ravens tend to communicate with their peers in sign language. Until recently, this kind of behavior was found only in chimpanzees. Ravens turned out to be even more advanced in nonverbal communication. While the skills of monkeys come down to simply pointing at something, birds also react constructively to the reciprocal gestures of their interlocutor, adjusting their further narration. Researchers published a report in the journal Nature Communications, in which they claim this discovery makes ravens comparable not only to higher apes, but even to humans. Here's how the experiment went. In the alpine forests near the village of Grünau in central Austria, Pica and Bugniar caught several individuals from the same colony of ravens and marked them. They then spent several months filming their daily lives with a digital camera, and then the resulting materials were carefully studied. Analysis of communication between birds in pairs as well as meetings with familiar ravens showed the predominance of the classical dialogue between birds. The essence is that when one of the ravens finds something interesting, for example, an unusual piece of wood, moss, or a stone, it rushes to tell about its find to its relatives. Sometimes just to discuss the find, and sometimes to gift the dialogue partner. Before starting a conversation, the initiator bows its head and stands still for the other birds to decide whether they agree to exchange opinions or reject the proposal. When the birds are not busy with some urgent matters, which is usually the case, they turn to the initiator and look at it, or at the object found. Rejection of the conversation may look like ignoring the bow or an aggressive outburst. Such sharing, as ornithologists suggest, strengthens relationships in family pairs and in the raven colony as a whole. Finally, the third and enigmatic way of communication is the ability to pass the finest subtleties and details not only from one crow to another, but even through generations of birds. Crows are able to distinguish and memorize a person's face for years without any dependence on the type of clothing, especially if the person tries to offend one of the birds. They will recognize this person in a year, and 10 years. Even the grandchildren of the present birds who have never seen the offender and have not suffered in any way from his actions will recognize him. The fact that some individuals are dangerous will be quickly learned by virtually all local crows who have not witnessed the crime. And this often turns into a mass conspiracy of crows. When seeing the person, they begin to screech loudly, circle over him, and embellish his clothes with white droppings of their own making. They can even find the house of the offender and do various mischief. A vivid example of such vindictiveness of crows is regularly experienced by a resident of India, Shiva Kiwat. The story was even featured in the Times of India, then on television, and then it spread on the internet. In 2016, this man tried to rescue a baby crow stuck in a metal net, but it did not survive. Since then, every time he leaves his house, he is attacked by aggressive crows. He has to carry a stick with him for self-defense. "I just wave it around to shoo them off," says Kiwat. The man sadly recounts the distressing misunderstanding the birds had towards him. "It died in my hands," said Kiwat. "If only I could explain to them I was only trying to help." Do you realize what else this means? Crows are much more prone to empathy than we previously thought. It became impossible to ignore this quality when more and more evidence emerged of how crows deal with the deaths of their kin. Many times people have noticed that when a dead crow is found, other crows start to make alarming cries, and more crows join them. Then they would perch on nearby trees, sit silently for a while, as if in a mournful memorial ritual, and then take off altogether and fly away. In other cases, seeing a dead crow, other birds began to behave not quite normally at first glance. For example, this footage caused quite an uproar once. Indeed, the sight is, to put it mildly, creepy. Nevertheless, it also has a ritual explanation. In general, the unusual and conscious behavior of crows with the dead gave rise to a new branch of science, corvid thanatology. But the most amazing behavior is demonstrated by crows under more cheerful circumstances, and this really breaks the mold. Crows can entertain themselves in ways that go far beyond the typical playful fumbling you've all seen from puppies or kittens. And here are two crows' friends enjoying improvised rope swinging. They take turns or do it together, and obviously, do it just for fun. The cameras of researchers or ordinary passers-by have many times caught crows playing a kind of team game. Astonished citizens have often noticed how crows and jackdaws gather in flocks and play. The birds get on a hill and try to push each other down. Or they fly in the air with a stone in their beaks and push each other intentionally. The bird that can't hold the stone and drops it down loses. Well, we think that it loses because that's what it looks like. It's just so similar to human games that nothing else comes to mind. And of course, we should point out the unique sense of humor of crows. Yes, you heard it right. Crows love pranking and trolling. The internet is full of videos from passers-by in which crows pester cats or dogs, snatch their tails, and hinder hunting. Here, for example, is footage of a crow dragging a rat by the tail, and the latter cannot get rid of the annoying feathered creature. The important thing is that the crow is either trolling the rat or trying to play with it. It's not trying to harm it, otherwise it would have killed it with a single strong beak strike on its head. Crows are capable of pecking a small animal to minced meat in a matter of seconds. Or Here is footage of a crow intending to grab a cat's tail and putting its feet in a position that would allow it to get away instantly. That is, it realizes perfectly well that the swishing cat's tail is not a worm or anything edible. On the contrary, it understands that it might get in trouble for such jokes, and yet it repeats the action time and time again because it just can't help herself. This clearly amuses and delights it. Or here's some absolutely adorable footage of a crow befriending a dog and playing together. It's as strange as if a butterfly had befriended a frog. They're so different, and they're enemies rather than friends in nature. And this quarrel between a crow and a cat is simply unbelievable. It's just fantastic. So, maybe it's time to recognize the crow family as an intelligent species, taking into account that they can outperform even monkeys in many intellectual characteristics. Obviously, that's not going to happen in the foreseeable future, but we can at least try to get closer to these amazing creatures and begin to interact more with them. Perhaps ravens and crows will become not just an amusing species living in symbiosis with mankind, but our real friends and helpers, like dogs, for example. And such examples already exist. For example, in 2018, the administration of the Puy du Fou theme park in France trained 6 crows to collect garbage at historic reserve. The crows picked up cigarette butts and small garbage. They brought all the waste to a special box, which automatically gave the birds a treat for their work. Park manager Nicolas de Villers said that the essence of this campaign is rather entertaining. The aim is not just to clean up, because usually guests try to keep the park clean, he said. Many birds living in the park easily make contact with people and show their attitude to those around them in a playful way. But 4 years later, in 2022, Sweden decided to involve crows in garbage collection in all seriousness. A Swedish company with a self-explanatory name Corvid Cleaning has developed a method of attracting wild crows to this socially useful activity. In a pilot project, the birds collect cigarette butts discarded in the streets and squares of the city Södertälje and put them in a special box. The project involves wild crows which receive food for each cigarette butt put in the box. According to the company's founder Christian Gunther Hasen, only wild birds are involved in the collection who show interest in the task on their own. No one forces them or specifically trains them. The project was launched as part of the effort to combat street litter and reduce the city's cleaning costs. According to the Keep Sweden Tidy Foundation, more than 1 billion cigarette butts are left on the streets of Sweden every year, which is 62% of all litter in the country. Södertälje spends 20 million SEK on street cleaning, which is equivalent to more than $1.9 million. According to Gunther Hasen, the involvement of wild crows in the collection of cigarette butts in the city could save at least 75% of costs in this sector. Alternatively, birds could also help people secure important sites. Remember the example of that poor Italian guy being hounded by crows for allegedly killing a baby crow? And the excellent memory of crows, which holds images for many years, could really help identify fugitive criminals. Who knows? Perhaps in the future, the minions of the law will be accompanied by feathered assistants, along with police dogs. And then it would be just one step away from having a crow as a witness in a case, or maybe even an investigator.